Guten Erev Shabbos. How's everybody doing? Shabbos is almost here. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a beautiful Yom Shishi, Friday, the 6th day of the week? Yehudit checking in from South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Stephen in New Hampshire, Shandora in the Bronx, Renee wishing everyone good Shabbos, Franco Zanini checking in from Istanbul. Wow! Welcome from Istanbul. Gordo checking in from Scotland. Beautiful. Love the long distance students. Brenda in Missouri. Belle wishing us a good Shabbos from Texas. Thank you, Sal and Nina. And thank you again to the class for the prayers on behalf of our daughter. And may she have a complete healing. A refuah shalema. Over there on the YouTube side, nobody checking in yet. Okay. I wish I could promise you a fascinating daf, but we are continuing our discussion here of Mishna number 2 in chapter 7 of tractate Nazir. Today's daf is Nun Gimel, page 53, and we're continuing this discussion of somebody who takes an oath of Naziris will abstain from produce of the grapevine for all the days of his Naziris vow, and he will not remove his hair, not cut, not shave, etc., and he must not become impure for the dead. And if he does become impure for the dead, he has to bring the offerings of impurity and restart the count of days of his Naziris. So what counts as becoming impure for the dead? Obviously, if you touch a human corpse, if you assist in the burial, the funeral, etc., and you touch the corpse, so you became tameh, ritually impure for the dead, you have to go through that 7-day purification. You have to bring the offerings of impurity if you're a Nazir and start the days over. If you cause that corpse to be moved, in other words, you've carried it, even if you didn't touch it directly, you became impure for the dead. If you're in the same room with a corpse, a human corpse, that's a corpse tuma of a tent, and you became impure for the dead. Now, what if it's only a partial corpse? That's what we've been discussing yesterday. We went through a long derivation, and we showed that the sages agree, not all agree, but that's where the law came out, that a spine or a skull amounts to, if you touch only a spine or only a skull of a corpse, it's like touching the whole corpse. And you can see why a spine or a skull would be considered such a significant part of the corpse. We also have encountered a few measures: minimum size of bone fragments, a minimum quantity or volume of bone fragments together. We talked about corpse dust, blood that gathers from a corpse, collected even from two corpses. And we continue that discussion, and we pick it up at the bottom of page 52b. Rami Bar Chama raised a dilemma. So it's a little bit of a technical daf. Let's see if we can just get into a meditative zone and pick up as much information as we can, and even see if we can understand the underlying principles that are involved, and could we even find kind of the spiritual meaning of these pretty technical laws about the Nazir becoming impure for the dead. So Rami Bar Chama raised a dilemma with regard to a quarter-kav of bones. So a kav is like 24 egg bolts. A quarter-kav is like 6 egg bulks, I believe. Right, so with regard to a quarter-kav of bones from a spine and a skull, what is the law? Does a Nazir shave for them? Meaning, does he become impure for the dead and has to restart his Naziris? And the Gemara explains the two sides of the dilemma when the Mishna teaches that one shaves for a half-kav of bones. So that's the minimum measure of, sort of little bone fragments. Are we going to consider that it amounts to a whole corpse? If there's a half kav, I don't know, maybe it's something like this volume-wise. So now we're saying, well, what if we have only half that amount, but those bones come from the spine or the skull, which we've already stated is a significant set of bones, the spine and the skull. So if this quarter-kav, which ordinarily would not amount to the minimum measure, but if it comes from the spine and the skull, then does it impart impurity of the dead? Right, so when the Mishnah teaches that one shaves for half a kav of bones, this is applying only when they are from other limbs, but in the case of bones from the spine and skull, which we know are stringent, as they impart ritual impurity on their own, perhaps even a quarter-kav of bones imparts impurity. Or perhaps it is no different, and doesn't matter what part of the body they come from. You need a half kav to constitute the minimum measure, a sort of loose bones that impart impurity. So Rava said, come and hear a resolution from the Mishnah, which teaches the spine and the skull. And if it enters your mind that a quarter-kav of bones that comes from a spine and skull is more stringent than other limbs and imparts ritual impurity, so let the Tana teach this law in a manner that presents a greater novelty by stating, and for a quarter-kav of bones that comes from the spine and the skull. In other words, why did the Mishnah mention this idea, which is learned by tradition? Right, the laws included in this Mishnah are learned by tradition. What are the minimum measures to impart impurity? And this one that you're suggesting here in the Gemara was not included in the Mishnah. And since it wasn't included, it must be that it's not a law. Now we're on 53a. Now the Gemara expresses surprise at this argument, but wasn't it Rava himself who said this statement is necessary only for a whole spine and skull that do not contain a quarter-kav of bones? So this indicates that in his opinion, a quarter-kav of bones from a spine does impart ritual impurity. The Gemara answers, after he heard the statement of the Tana, he understood from Rabbi Akiva that his dispute in the Baraisa on page 52 concerns a spine and skull from two corpses, not a quarter-kav from a spine and skull, and this interpretation led Rava to change his mind. Now the Gemara further suggests, come and hear a resolution from the following. Shammai, who, generally in disputes between Shammai and Hillel, we'll see that Shammai has the more stringent opinion. Certainly the schools of Shammai and Hillel. Base Shammai has usually a more stringent opinion than base Hillel. So Shammai himself says that one bone from the spine or from the skull imparts ritual impurity. Now, this is obviously a very stringent opinion. We've talked about a spine or a skull. Now we're just talking one bone from either one of those is going to impart ritual impurity according to Shammai. Now, although the rabbis, the majority, dispute his ruling, it can be assumed that they do not have a vastly different opinion. I don't know why we can assume that, but okay. Rather, they accept that a quarter-kav from a spine imparts impurity and renders a Nazir obligated to shave. And the Gemara rejects this proof. But Shammai is different, as he is very stringent, and therefore nothing at all can be inferred from his opinion with regard to that of the rabbis. You can't say that the rabbis are only going to be a little less stringent than Shammai. Maybe they're a lot less stringent. So we don't have a proof. So the Gemara counters, if in fact the rabbis maintain an extremely different opinion from that of Shammai, so let us resolve the problem in the opposite manner. The reasoning here is that of Shammai, who is particularly stringent, and from this it may be inferred that according to the opinion of the rabbis, one is not rendered impure, and the Nazir is not required to shave and restart his Naziris, unless there is the required minimum measure that we normally adopt, which is a half-kav of bones, even from the spine and skull. But the Gemara rejects this claim as well. Perhaps the argument is not that extreme after all, and the rabbis disagree with Shammai only with regard to whether one bone from the spine or from the skull imparts impurity. However, with regard to a quarter-kav of bones, even the rabbis might concede that it renders people and items ritually impure, and a Nazir must shave for it. And they leave the argument there. We don't know. Rabbi Eliezer said that some of the early elders would say a half-kav of bones and a half-lug of blood impart ritual impurity in all forms. And their impurity applies by Torah law, and therefore they impart impurity in a tent. Right? So again, a corpse imparts impurity in a tent, meaning even if you didn't touch it, even if you didn't cause it to move, even if you didn't carry it, even if you didn't really come that close to it at all, but you were under the same roof with it, then by Torah law, a corpse imparts full corpse impurity. It's called the impurity of the tent. So, Do parts of corpses impart in the same way? Well, if they have the minimum measure. So where are we? They do not. Yeah. So they do not impart impurity in all forms, meaning they do not impart impurity in a tent. And some of these elders would say that even a quarter-kav of bones and a quarter lug of blood do impart impurity in all forms, including impurity of a tent. Now, this was a dispute in earlier generations. So the court that followed them said a half-kav of bones and a half-lug of blood impart impurity in all forms, right? So that minimum measure, a half-kav or a half-lug, imparts impurity through touching, carrying, and through a tent. But less than that does not impart impurity, according to this court that came later than the earlier sages who could not come to agreement upon this. In all forms. Now, a quarter-kav of bones and a quarter lug of blood impart impurity only with regard to teruma and offerings, right? So that they will render consecrated foods impure if they come into contact with that, but is not going to render a person impure with corpse tuma, which requires that full 7-day purification. So they said... So they impart impurity, the quarter-kav and quarter lug impart impurity only with regard to teruma and offerings. In other words, the sages decreed that they impart impurity in a tent to invalidate teruma and offerings, but not with regard to a Nazir. A Nazir is not required to shave or bring offerings for impurity after contact with a quarter-kav of bones or a quarter lug of blood. Now here it doesn't say anything about if it comes from the spine or skull. It's just a quarter-kav of bones. And similarly, one who performs the ritual of the Paschal offering, right, bringing the Pesach offering, the Passover lamb or goat, which is only brought when the temple is standing. So we haven't brought that offering in almost 2,000 years. But when the temple is standing, that's a big, big mitzvah. And one who is involved in it has to be in a state of purity. So similarly, one who performs the ritual of the Paschal offering may proceed despite the fact that he came into contact with this amount of blood, the quarter lug of blood or the quarter-kav of bones, as the sages did not apply this decree in cases where one's impurity it precludes the performance of a mitzvah whose neglect is punishable by kares. It's excision, right? Death at the hands of the heavenly court. So the Gemara asks about the ruling of law in this case. Now, consider, there is a principle that the decision of the third opinion is not considered a decision. What does this mean? Right, we had an earlier dispute among the sages that couldn't come to agreement on this minimum measure. And then a later court said the minimum is a half-kav of bones or a half-lug of blood. Are we now going to say that this later court did not settle the matter? A compromise ruling that seeks to resolve a dispute by including factors in cases that were not mentioned in the other two opinions is not considered decisive. So how could the later court make a distinction between a Paschal offering and other cases? And Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi said, this ruling was not stated as a compromise. Rather, they said it from tradition, from Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last of the prophets. This was not a new attempt to mediate between two earlier opinions, but an ancient ruling in its own right, which made it acceptable. So the Mishnah taught that for all these aforementioned sources of ritual impurity, which we've been discussing since we read Mishnah number 2 a few days ago, for all of these, if the Nazir comes into contact with them, he shaves, he interrupts his Naziris, brings the offerings of impurity, has to restart the count of days. Now the Gemara explains that and he has to shave. And so the Gemara explains that the phrase "for these" in the Mishnah's first clause serves to exclude a bone that is a barley grain bulk, right? So a bone that is that small is not going to impart ritual impurity of a corpse. As for touching it and carrying it, yes, a Nazir shaves. But for his overlying it, no, he does not shave. Overlying it means that his body formed a tent over this piece of bone. He himself was acting like the tent. So since he was over that bone, he becomes impure like corpse tuma. So for this very small bone, if he touches it or carries it, yes. But for just coming above it, no, he does not shave. And the phrase for these in the Mishnah's latter clause serves to exclude an overhanging stone. Although a stone that forms a cover over a corpse, right? We said that if you're under the same roof, now you don't have to necessarily be in a tent or in a house with a corpse if you're under a roof. So if you have an overhanging rock, like a cantilevered rock, then you're under the roof with it and you became impure for the dead. Although a stone that forms a cover over a corpse imparts impurity in a tent, a Nazir is nevertheless not obligated to shave due to this source of impurity. So you would think that, wait a minute, you're under a roof with it, so then you became impure for the dead. But now they're saying, no, just an overhanging stone is not going to count as as sharing a roof, being under the same roof with a corpse, to the extent that a Nazir has to shave. However, that's what the Gemara says. What is the law? Rambam rules in Sefer Haflah, if branches protruding from a tree or stones jutting out from a wall serve as a tent over a Nazir and a corpse, the Nazir need not shave or negate his Nazir. So the law came out like the Gemara. Next, in its list of sources of impurity for which a Nazir must shave, the Mishnah taught and a half-kav of bones. Now we're on 53b. Now the Gemara analyzes this ruling of the Mishnah. A half-kav of bones, yes, a Nazir must shave if he contracts impurity from them. A quarter-kav of bones, no, he does not. What are the circumstances if we say they contain bones that are a barley grain bulk, very small? Let the Tana of the Mishnah derive the law that it imparts ritual impurity due to the fact that it is a bone that is a barley grain bulk. Rather, the Mishnah is referring to a situation where the bones have been ground like flour. In that case, a half-kav of bones render people and items impure in a tent, even though none of the bones in that mixture are themselves the size of a barley grain bulk. I mean, we've thought, I did not realize that we've been talking about when you have a half-kav of bones, so you need that volume of like bones that are like ground up, almost like flour. Because if you have even a little piece of bone the size of a barley grain, that's enough. It doesn't matter whether you have a half-kav or not. Just the one bone will do, right? So if you come into contact with one bone, now this is very surprising because what did we talk about? We said a spine or a skull renders one impure. So what about a femur, right? So it sounds like a femur, yes, of course, because it's the size, it's more than the minimum size. So when we were talking about a spine or a skull, I mean, that should have just qualified just by the size alone, unless it had been ground up. Now, the Mishnah taught that a Nazir shaves for a limb severed from a corpse and for a limb severed from a living person, upon either of which there is a fitting quantity of flesh. So the Gemara asks, if there is not a fitting quantity of flesh upon them, what is the law? And Rabbi Yochanan said the Nazir does not shave for them, and Reish Lakish said the Nazir does shave for them. And the Gemara explains their respective opinions. Rabbi Yochanan said the Nazir does not shave for them, as the Tana teaches in the first clause of the Mishnah, in the list of sources of ritual impurity for which a Nazir must shave, quote, for a limb severed from a corpse and for a limb severed from a living person that contains a fitting quantity of flesh. And one can infer from this, those upon which there is an olive bulk of flesh, yes, he must shave for them. But if there's not that amount of flesh, no, a Nazir does not shave due to them. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says that he shaves, employing the following reasoning. From the fact that the Mishnah does not teach the following in the later clause, i.e. the subsequent Mishnah that we're going to encounter tomorrow night, page 54. In the list of sources of impurity for which a Nazir need not shave, a limb that does not contain a fitting quantity of flesh, one can infer that a Nazir is obligated to shave for a limb of that type. And Rabbi Yochanan could have said to you in response to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's argument, the fact that the Mishnah omits this case from the list, that's not a proof, as the Tana of the Mishnah does not teach in the latter clause anything that can be understood by inference from the earlier Mishnah. These two Mishnahs are not coming as a unit. where either it's in one or it's spoken in the negative in the other, or it's not covered, right? They're teaching slightly different ideas, so you can't use that logic. So the Gemara raises a difficulty against this claim of Rabbi Yochanan, but the first clause of the Mishnah lists the case of a half-kav of bones, which indicates a half-kav of bones. Yes, a Nazir must shave for that. A quarter-kav of bones. No, he is not obligated to shave for that. And yet, the Tana who composed our Mishnah teaches in the later clause that a Nazir does not shave for a quarter-kav of bones. And this shows that the next Mishnah does not rely on the rulings of this Mishnah. Rather, it lists all the items for which a Nazir need not shave. But the Gemara rejects this argument. There, had the Tana not taught a quarter-kav of bones, I would say that he need not shave even for touching it or carrying it. And for this reason, it was necessary for the Mishnah to teach the case of a quarter-kav of bones to indicate that it is only for their ritual impurity contracted in a tent that a Nazir does not shave, but for touching or carrying, he does. So the Gemara raises a further difficulty. But the Mishnah lists a half lug of blood among those sources of impurity for which a Nazir must shave, from which you can learn that for the half lug of blood, yes, he shaves. For a quarter lug of blood, no, he does not shave. And yet, the latter clause, meaning the next Mishnah, teaches that he need not shave for a quarter lug of blood. So the Gemara answers, it is also necessary to state this law unambiguously, there to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva said a quarter lug of blood that comes from two corpses renders people and items impure in a tent, whereas the Mishnah simply states a quarter lug, which indicates that all of the blood comes from a single corpse. So the Gemara analyzes the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What are the circumstances of this limb severed from a corpse that is not covered by sufficient flesh? If it contains a bone that is a barley grain bulk, what is Rabbi Yochanan's reason for maintaining that a Nazir does not shave for the ritual impurity? A bone of this size imparts impurity even if there is no flesh on it. And if it does not contain a bone that is a barley grain bulk, then what is Reish Lakish's reason for saying that a Nazir must shave due to this bone? And the Gemara explains that Reish Lakish could have said to you, actually, we are dealing with a limb that does not contain a bone that is a barley grain bulk. And even so, the merciful one includes it as a source of ritual impurity. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa, based on Numbers 19:16. Quote from the Torah, and whoever in the open field touches one who is slain by the sword, or one who dies on his own, or a bone of a man, or of a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. This is the home page, the source in the Torah for the 7-day ritual purification required of one who comes into contact with the dead. Right? This is where it's defined, becoming impure for the dead. Recall, this doesn't only apply to the Nazir. Any person, you can become impure for the dead, you haven't done anything wrong. But if you are impure for the dead, and then you enter the temple, the holy temple when it's standing in Jerusalem, then you've made a serious transgression. And that's based on this Numbers 19:16. Now this verse is expounded by the sages like this. In the open field, this is referring to the law of one who overlies a corpse, right? That you yourself form the tent over the corpse, even if you don't touch it. One who is slain. This is referring to a limb that is slain, meaning a limb that is severed from a living person that contains enough flesh for the limb to heal. Right, the limb is slain in the sense that if, God forbid, somebody has a terrible accident or is in war and his arm is cut off, right, he could continue to live without an arm, but that arm cannot continue to live without him. So the limb has been slain, as it were. Right, and then what we're saying is that limb, for it, that somebody else comes into contact with that severed limb, it has to have enough flesh on it for that limb to survive, if it had remained attached to a person. So the sages, and I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. The sages further derive from the phrase, one who is slain by the sword, that the legal status of a metal sword, in terms of its degree of ritual impurity, is like that of one who is slain. A sword that killed a person imparts ritual impurity as if you touch the dead person. if you touch that metal implement. Right? A sword that was rendered impure through contact with a corpse is impure to the same degree of severity as a corpse itself. And we derive that from this phrase. Now, the next phrase, or one who dies on his own. This is a limb that was severed from a corpse and is covered with enough flesh that it would heal if he were alive. And the next phrase, or a bone of a man. This refers to the quarter-kav of bones. And the phrase, or a grave. And this is a sealed grave which imparts impurity when there is less than a handbreadth between the corpse and its cover. And that's where we're going to leave off. We'll pick this up tomorrow night after Shabbos ends. So the clocks changed last week. So now Shabbos is going to end quite a bit later, right? So Shabbos begins here at 6:44. It's going to end at 7:39. You know, I'm going to try to get on the air by like 8:15 Pacific. We'll be doing page 54, God willing, and then we'll get past this Mishna number 2 and start Mishna number 3, right? Mishna number 2 was for these sources of ritual impurity, a Nazir shaves. Mishna number 3 is going to be for these sources of ritual impurity, a Nazir does not shave. So we'll see that tomorrow night. Nina, I believe, got caught doing some Shabbos shopping. So I need to scan the comments myself for questions. Renee, wondering if a vow of Naziris would excuse one from frontline military service. Very interesting question, right? On the one hand, as a policy matter, you're not going to let people off the hook just because they took a vow that is not only unnecessary, but is discouraged by the sages. On the other hand, if a person took that vow, you know, he's almost necessarily going to be coming into contact with the dead. Now, maybe that's his problem, right? He shouldn't have taken that vow. Now he's just going to have to, you know, do what he's ordered to do. And when he becomes impure, which is likely to happen, okay, so he's going to have to go through the rituals of purification and bring his offerings of impurity and restart his count. Certainly one who's going to war should not be taking a vow of Naziris. Is that all the questions? I think that's all the questions that I can spot at a glance over there on Facebook. And Marjorie on YouTube. This daf might not be scintillating, but to me, it still emphasizes the negotiation between the law as a whole and its parts, or theory versus practice, if you will. That is a good point, Marjorie. It is not only serious and studious rabbinic practice, it is also our study today, an active religious experience of studying Torah. And whoever said that was always easy or exciting, just so, right? It's sort of like, if you're an athlete, right? And then, you'd like to always be practicing scoring the game-winning goal or the game-winning basket. But you also have to practice the dribbling and the shooting and the, whatever your sport is, all the daily grind, and then sometimes something wonderful emerges, but it is absolutely a fact that on the, these pages that are not obviously exciting, we are nevertheless growing in our understanding of how to read the Gemara, how to read the Torah, how to derive principles, understanding how the sages derived principles. And Yasher Koach to us, may we be strengthened to begin and end many pages, no matter what kind of content they are. If we're studying Holy Scripture and we're studying the oral tradition, then we are fulfilling an obligation, and may we merit to begin and end many tractates together as a class. A very good Shabbos to you, and I look forward to learning with you again tomorrow night after Shabbos ends. Good Shabbos.